Good evening from New York. Head-On, a headache remedy designed to be applied directly to the forehead. Its manufacturers try to sell it with possibly the most obnoxious commercial of all time, in which the product's name is screamed repeatedly at the viewer. Wednesday night, Head-On pulled its commercials from Imus in the morning. When Head-On thinks you are damaging its reputation, you can pretty much guess that you are pretty much finished. Our fifth story on the countdown, finished he apparently is. And just because Don Imus's MSNBC show was already history, the finishing was not finished. CBS Chairman Les Moonves saying the effect language like this has on young people, particularly young women of color trying to make their way in the society, has weighed most heavily on our minds as we made our decision, canceling Imus's radio program late this afternoon. Imus's radio affiliates in Portland, Oregon and Charleston, South Carolina had already canceled the program during the day. His boss, Moonves' boss, Viacom Chair Sumner Redstone, had already said he was certain Moonves would, quote, do the right thing about Imus's program, syndicated to about 70 stations around the country. And this morning, Imus himself had said the cancellation of the MSNBC part of his broadcast meant little because viewership was only a few 100,000. It was radio that mattered because millions listened. He spent what he did not know was his last radio show, alternating between insisting his friends should not whine about media coverage of his shame and also insisting that the coverage was hypocritical or showed hypocrisy. He used those words at least 6 times while calling MSNBC unethical. This from a man who believed he and his on-air staff were entitled to make sexual, racial, ethnic, or homophobic jokes about anybody and everybody, a man who reduced women staffers at MSNBC to tears and conned one of them into coming on the air and saying embarrassing things about her co-workers, which led to her dismissal from the company, a man whose ethics were so high that in the NBC case at least, the traditionally distant nature of corporate America had to listen to the better angels of its nature, when virtually all the employees of a network and an entire news division said, we have understood that you haven't fired him the last 10,000 times, but you have to do it now. The last word was that Imus was still to meet tonight at the New Jersey governor's mansion with Vivian Stringer, the coach of the Rutgers women basketball players, and the players themselves, the ones Imus had called, quote, nappy-headed hoes. Earlier today, the players appeared by satellite with Oprah Winfrey.
It seemed like the world came down on us to be the focal point of such a remark. And, you know, it's just so sad because no one actually pays attention who actually won the game. He didn't only steal from us, he actually stole from, you know, a grateful team like Tennessee.
As we explore what happens next, let's turn to Max Robbins, Editor-in-Chief of Broadcasting and Cable Magazine. Thank you for your time tonight, sir.
Good to see you, Keith.
We'll talk big picture about shock radio and broadcasting in a moment. First, is there any more to the radio part of the Imus story that we don't know? I mean, it takes a lot to get yourself fired in the middle of a charity radiothon.
It does indeed, Keith, and I think it really does speak to the most important thing as the bottom line here in why he was fired. I mean, I'd like to think that your bosses at NBC and Les Moonves was listening to all his employees were outraged by what Imus, as you said, quite rightly, has been doing for years. This isn't the first time. This isn't an isolated incident, and that they pulled the plug on the guy. I think the minute advertisers started pulling out, as you noted at the top of the show, Imus's days, hours on the radio were numbered.
Have an idea just how bad that advertiser issue was? The last thing I'd heard as of yesterday, before it became an academic issue at NBC, was that the count of advertisers who'd pulled out, and this was for the whole picture, not just radio or television, but that it was approaching triple digits. Have you heard the same thing?
Yeah, I've heard the same numbers, Keith, and I think that really that meant it was all over. Really, the marketplace is what rules here, and in saying that, it does say something about how that marketplace has changed and how there is increasingly less tolerance for this kind of just unfunny, stupid, racist banter.
That big picture, is there a sea change in this? There was a disc jockey in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, who heard what Imus had said and declared it his phrase of the day, and anybody who called into his show and said nappy-headed hose got a prize. That was this Tuesday. It was considered edgy. Wednesday, they fired him. Today, Imus was fired for the second time in 2 days. Did a bunch of the shock jocks and commentators just wake up to an entirely new world?
I don't really think so, Keith. I mean, and I don't think they should. Look, I'm the editor-in-chief of a magazine that has a 75-year tradition of defending broadcasters' rights to the First Amendment. But we also have rights as listeners, as people who own companies, advertisers, what they're going to put up with and what they're not going to put up with. So I don't think we need to be in I'm glad that there's a lot of diversity of opinion, but you do have to ask what's too far. And I say, you let the market decide. I mean I think this was the right decision here. But I don't think we should go out there and start, passing laws, or the FCC should get involved in saying what you can and cannot say on the air.
Well, as you recognize the marketplace and the idea of, the advertisers got them, the advertisers are just a sort of a refraction of public opinion anyway. So there is something still self-regulating about a market in those places. But how does that apply to the big guys in this, the people whose language or racism or sexism or just tone was seemingly grandfathered in much the way Don Imus's was? What about Limbaugh, O'Reilly, Glenn Beck, Michael Savage? Any change anticipated in any of those areas?
I think we should all listen closely and see. I mean, I got to think that they are going to be scrutinized a lot more closely today than they were 48 hours ago.
And Al Sharpton walked out of his meeting with CBS today saying he couldn't trust that company while it still employed Imus, and Sharpton and Jesse Jackson both trying to talk to all the big media companies right now, trying to, I think the phrase taking advantage is not an inappropriate or unfair one, but taking advantage of these circumstances to say, hey, by the way, the other problem here is that you have few people of color in television and radio in key positions. They've been pushing it for decades. Is there some indication that this will now be approached the way the National Football League approaches you must interview minority candidates for coaching jobs? Will there be an actual push in broadcasting to try to correct that seeming imbalance?
I'm not really so sure that will happen. I think that there's a lot more diversity in executive suites and on camera and on air and what we see in prime time than there has been. I mean, I think that continues to change. Certainly, there's room for more change, and I think the better off the medium of television is, the industry of television is, the more voices that are heard, and there's certainly room for more of it. I don't know if Reverend Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson are the best advocates for this.
J. Max Robbins of Broadcasting and Cable Magazine, great thanks for your time tonight, sir.
Thank you, Keith.
Let's look at the twin firings in an even bigger context, and for that, my pleasure to turn now to Bob Herbert, op-ed columnist for the New York Times, who's also had considerable TV experience under his belt. Bob, thanks for your time tonight.
Keith, I appreciate it.
A very simple question. Why did this happen when other occasions did not result in a guy getting fired from both network and network television and radio?
Well, I think for one thing, the phrase itself was just so noxious that it was shocking. I mean, I think the phrase is something just shy of the N-word, frankly. And then the fact of who was his target. Even before the Rutgers basketball team had their press conference, people were outraged over the fact that these were college students.